One topic that I've always found interesting in TV shows is that of sexuality. I'm always interested in stories that explore sex, the attraction between two people, and more importantly, how they portray those things to their audience. Because sex is an interesting contradiction. It's a very adult topic, just like violence. But unlike violence, sex is an anomaly because it's also a necessity. Without it, you wouldn't exist. No one would. But at the same time, you better not talk about it, cause it's naughty. And it's this duality, the fact that sex is both natural and a stigma, that makes it such an interesting theme in storytelling. And surprisingly, one show that has covered this topic with some of the most subtlety and complexity of any I've seen is a little slice of life anime called Miss Kobayashi's Dragon Maid. But first, to fully understand Miss Kobayashi, we need to take a look at the history of sex in TV. Back in the day, sex in shows was, obviously, almost non-existent. Media in general was extremely censored back in the 50s and 60s. I Love Lucy was a cultural phenomenon starting from 1951 and ran all the way till 1960. The show portrayed a nuclear family that got themselves into silly hijinks, but was rather tame. There wasn't anything controversial or provocative here, and that includes sex. In fact, it was so tame that when Lucy realized she was pregnant, she couldn't actually say that word on screen. And this wasn't just the case with Lucy. The name of the game back then was to make things that felt warm and inviting, and that didn't challenge or threaten the audience in any way. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that. I mean, that's the entire appeal of slice-of-life animes like Dragon Maid. Sometimes people just need an escape, and that is perfectly fine. But the main difference is that this was disingenuous. You ever hear old people say that there wasn't as much crime back when they were young, or that people didn't do as horrible things as they do now? Well, first off, that's not true. And I think a big part of that misconception is this sort of censorship. One would assume that the media a society produces in turn reflects that society. So if you watch a show from the 50s and 60s, then yeah, you can see why people think those were better times. Lots of clean-shaven people smiling and helping out strangers and raising their perfect children, and mommy and daddy sleep in separate beds for some reason. But this isn't an accurate representation of what that time period was really like. Crime and disease and homosexuality didn't cease to exist simply because I Love Lucy didn't talk about them. Wars still happened, presidents were assassinated, and a lot of people feared for their lives every day from the Soviet Union. So they weren't showing these topics and went to ridiculous lengths to hide them, but they were still happening. In fact, that was actually a rule they had for writers on the Dick Van Dyke Show. No slang, and no pop culture references. The show existed entirely in a bubble. And George Takei actually pushed to have an episode of the original Star Trek which would parallel issues regarding gays in society, but it was ultimately rejected. And again, I don't think there is anything wrong with a show that's meant to be a safe place or an escape. But these are extremes that misrepresent reality as a result. And believe it or not, this problem is actually what led to the creation of The Twilight Zone. Rod Serling, the show's creator, made the show because he was fed up with censorship in television and he felt suffocated by it. There's a wonderful interview from Serling where he's promoting his new show, and it's a fascinating watch. And, well, just let the man speak for himself.
Paddy Chayefsky has talked about the insidious influence of what he calls pre-censorship. How does that work?
Pre-censorship is a practice, I think, of most television writers. I can't speak for all of them. This is the prior knowledge of the writer of those areas which are difficult to try to get through. And so a writer will shy away from writing those things which he knows he's going to have trouble with on the sponsorial or an agency level. We practice it all the time. We just do not write those themes which we know are going to get into trouble.
Who's the culprit? Is it the network, the sponsor? It sure is not the FCC.
No, it's certainly not the FCC, ideally speaking, of course. It's a combination of culprits in this case, Mike. It's partly network. It's principally agency and sponsor. In many ways, I think it's the audience themselves.
How do you mean?
Well, I'll give you an example. About a year ago, roughly 11 or 12 months ago, on the Lassie show, this is a story usually told by Sheldon Leonard, who was then associated with the show. Lassie was having puppies, and I have two little girls, then aged 5 and 3, who are greatly enamored of this beautiful collie, and they watched the show with great interest, and Lassie gave birth to puppies. And Mike, it was probably one of the most tasteful and delightful and warm things depicting what is this wondrous thing that is birth. And after the show, I think there were many congratulations all around because it was a lovely show. the sort of thing I'd love my kids to watch, to show them what is the birth process and how marvelous it is. They got many, many cards and letters. Sample card from the Deep South, this was. If I wanted my kids to watch sex shows, I wouldn't have had them turn on that. I could take them to burlesque shows. And as a result of the influx of mail, many of the cards, incidentally, as Sheldon tells it, were postmarked at identical moments, all in the same handwriting, but each was counted as a singular piece of mail. And as a result, the directive went down that there would be no shows having anything to do with puppies, that is, in the actual birth process. Well, obviously, it is this wild lunatic fringe of letter writers that greatly affect what the sponsor has in mind.
So yeah, Twilight Zone was actually created as a tool to combat censorship and to give more provocative writers a chance to express themselves. But the funny thing is, if you look at Twilight Zone, it's not really that far out there. It's still pretty tame by today's standards. That just speaks even more to how restrictive television was back then. This show doesn't have excessive gore or tons of swearing or new Ghibli bits all over the screen, but it challenged its audience, and that alone was a lot. And Twilight Zone was a big hit. It made people think and paved the way for more provocative television in the decades to come. And that brings us to now, the 2010s, whatever you want to call it. Whenever you have a big cultural shift like this, then in the process people tend to rebound a little too far in the opposite direction. And sadly, I think that's what's been happening this last decade. We've pushed the envelope so much these 50 years since that now we as a society have become completely desensitized to those naughty things we couldn't even say back then. We've got The Walking Dead, Orange is the New Black, Game of Thrones, and several shows about cannibalism for some reason. Boobs and blood reign supreme. Whereas the name of the game in the 50s was to make something that wouldn't provoke their audience, the opposite is now true. Shows are trying really hard to shock us as much as they can, and as a result, a lot of television has become needlessly grotesque. Now, you may be thinking that this is a double standard. I can't complain about a show censoring boobs and then complain about one flaunting them in front of me. But I think the thing that matters the most in this discussion is intentions. It doesn't matter if a show wants to avoid sex or explore it completely. The important question is why. I disapprove of Lucy's censorship because it's censored for the wrong reasons. And the same thing with Game of Thrones, just on the opposite end of the spectrum. The sex and nudity is offensive not because it's there, although I can't say I was comfortable watching this guy rape an 11-year-old, but because it's there through dubious intent. Like, take a look at this scene. This is Tyrion, one of the show's favorite characters. In the show, he's first introduced while visiting a prostitute. And the funny thing about this scene is it never existed in the book. It was added strictly for the show, to its detriment. Instead of introducing him to the audience through his defiant nature, or his doubtful optimism, or his wise, witty banter, Tyrion is instead first shown through his lust, which is still true to the character, but definitely a much less important trait. I think it hurts the character in the end because it gives him a weaker first impression. So if it wasn't for the sake of the story that this change was made, then why was it made? Well, like I said earlier, to be controversial. To give the show more of a hook to open with to draw people in. And I can prove this too. Well, maybe not prove, but provide a strong argument for at least. Take a look at this scene from the show. Catelyn and Ned are just chilling in bed and they get a knock on the door. In the book, these two are naked and just finished having sex. And later in the scene, Catelyn gets out from under her covers and walks around fully nude. But in the show, they are completely clothed and none of that happens. This is an example of the show censoring itself from the source material. Now, why is that when the show goes out of its way to show skin in other places? Well, I have a theory. I think it's probably because of Sean Bean. He was really the only A-list celebrity when the show started, and as such, I think it's safe to assume that he had an influence over production. I bet they told him about the scene and how he'd have to be completely nude on camera, and he was like, yeah, I'm not doing that. I'm Sean Bean. I've got options. Change the scene. And so they changed it. Again, this is just speculation on my part, but I think it's the most likely cause, especially when you look at the other evidence as well. Nearly all of the sexy time in Game of Thrones happens at the beginning, appearing in the first season of the show, and nearly non-existent by season 3 onwards. And this isn't just unique to Game of Thrones either. Look at other popular shows like Orange is the New Black and you'll see the same thing. Season 1 is swimming in nipples. Season 3, not so much. This is what I'm talking about with shows using sex to try and shock their audience. They front load it with this stuff to make it more controversial. It gets people talking, and they build up an audience, then once they've already established themselves, it goes away. Maybe appearing briefly once in a while just to make sure you're still watching. In these cases, sex isn't used because it's a key story element that's inseparable from the plot. It's just clickbait. That's the sad truth. This is high-budget Hollywood clickbait. And let me make one thing perfectly clear. I love these shows. Game of Thrones is one of my all-time favorites. It's so good. The pacing is great, storytelling is brilliant, characters complex, world rich with detail, and the cinematography in its action scenes is some of the best I've ever seen. Period. I love this show, but I love it in spite of its exploitative sex scenes, and I think that's an important distinction to make. And to be fair, some of the sexy time in Game of Thrones is relevant to the plot and characters. Most specifically Theon, because it has a lot to do with his ego, and I'll talk more about that when I cover Game of Thrones in the future. Anyways, so that's a rough history of sex on TV. First things were overly censored, and now the opposite is true. Through these shows, we've seen the two extremes of this spectrum and perfect examples of what not to do. And that begs the question, how does a show do sex right? Can it even be done? I think so. You just need to follow one simple guideline is all. If it's relevant to the plot, add it. That's it. And that applies to anything, not just sex. Violence, gore, language, and all adult themes, really. There's always a dubious way to do these things, where their addition is not for the sake of telling the best story possible. But to do them right, all you have to do is make them add something to the experience. Make sure the show is richer for them, and you're golden. And this is where Miss Kobayashi's Dragon Maid comes in. This show does so many things right, one of those being how it portrays the relationship between its two main characters, both emotionally and physically. See, a lot of anime falls somewhere around the middle right of this scale. You know what I'm talking about. The overly pervy characters, the cartoony freakouts and reactions, and the over-the-top accidents that get a character labeled as a pervert. The problem with these is, while they do show sexual themes, they still teach them as something inherently wrong. As mentioned before, sex is natural, and it's natural to be attracted to someone or to have honest accidents. But these scenarios are always played up to unnatural extremes and with a lot of negative connotations. When watching Dragon Maid, I was happily surprised to see none of this. Sure, the show has a lot of D for dragon, but it doesn't make these a detriment to its characters. Like, take Toru for example. She's attracted to Kobayashi, but Kobayashi rejects her. This is a dynamic we've seen a lot before. But the difference here is how this relationship works, and what it says about these two as a result. It's important to note that Kobayashi never shames Toru for it. She turns her down because, in her own words, she's not attracted to girls or dragons. She never scolds her, or shames her, or tells her that her advances are unwelcome. She just tells her when things cross a line and need to stop.
Okay, let me start with you, Miss Kobayashi.
Get weird and get fired.
And Toru always respects that. Well, usually.
I've said this before, so don't make me say it again. Please stop licking my laundry.
This is important because I feel it's a much healthier portrayal of this kind of relationship. Yes, it depicts one character throwing herself at another over and over, but it manages to do so without harming the mutual respect they hold for one another. It still feels like a relationship between two consenting individuals who just happen to be somewhat damaged in opposite ways. But more on that in a sec. First, for comparison, let's look at one of the most popular animes of all time, Dragon Ball. In Super, there's a scene where Master Roshi is, well, being an anime character. And a lot of people got really upset over this, saying that it was disrespectful and offensive towards women. Have you guys watched Dragon Ball before? This stuff happens all over the show, heck, all over the industry.
Don't blame me. She was practically begging me to fondle her.
You should spend more time brushing up on women's feelings and less time brushing up on their buns.
Haha, he just committed sexual harassment and has no consequences. Isn't that hilarious? But I think this particular one didn't sit well with people because we're currently in a transitional period. We've started heading towards a society built more on empathy and respect. Specifically, respect towards one's sexual identity. So a show where one of the good guys sexually harasses a complete stranger just isn't as funny as it used to be. And as I said earlier, sometimes people can rebound and get a little carried away with this sort of thing, but I think overall it's a great change. It's hard to make the case that a society based on acceptance and mutual respect is a bad thing, you know? And shows like Etsuyobi no Tawa wa and Miss Kobayashi are great representations of this cultural shift. They're still pervy animes, but they're also rather innocent compared to a lot that came before. They show healthier relationships and portray physical attraction as something that, if handled with respect, isn't anything that you should be ashamed of. In fact, Toru ends up criticizing Kobayashi in episode 8. Toru was acting out and the two just had a fight and Kobayashi asks what is going on. Toru basically tells her, "Dude, are you serious? I've been throwing myself at you for months now and you give me nothing in return. You know how hard it is to tell yourself someone likes you if they refuse to even say it?" And Kobayashi admits to this fault and apologizes for it. I feel like in the typical anime, this situation would have been reversed. It would have been Toru apologizing for always being so pervy, and Kobayashi would say something like, "It's alright, I know you're a great person regardless." But here, that's not the problem, because both characters are fine with their feelings. The problem instead being Kobayashi's fear of expressing her feelings in return. This shift in intention works a lot better because it's also more relatable. We've all been here before. We've all had a relationship where we've gotten jealous, or didn't say enough, or just assumed our feelings were known without actually saying them. Most of us cannot relate to being sexually assaulted, and for those of us who can, I doubt it's something you'd like to see taken lightly. So the irony is that this silly little anime about a dragon becoming a maid has more realistic and far more intimate relationships than one with actual people. Just look at the very first episode of Dragon Maid. The entire time Toru is pretty thirsty towards Kobayashi, but then the episode ends with the two of them sleeping in the same bed. I was surprised that nothing happened in this scene. Toru didn't throw herself onto Kobayashi, she didn't make any lewd comments, she didn't try anything at all. Not even an icebreaker after their emotional moment. Then in episode 3 you have a similar scene. Kobayashi is taking a bath, and Toru twists her words around so they can bathe together. And again, nothing happens here. Toru has Kobayashi completely naked, and she doesn't even so much as ogle her. And the more I think about these scenes, the more they make sense on two levels. First off is what I was talking about before, respect. The reason she doesn't try anything is because Kobayashi is vulnerable. Toru knows that if she were to make a move, it would shatter the trust she's working so hard to try and build, as well as cross a line that has been very clearly drawn. So instead of fan service or a bit more comedy, the show instead opts for touching moments of vulnerability between two damaged characters. And the second reason is intention. See, there's a deeper motivation to Toru's actions. She doesn't actually want to do it dragon style with Kobayashi. Because remember, she's not a human, she's a dragon. She doesn't even like humans and thinks they're a far inferior species.
Humans may gather together, help each other, and accomplish a lot of things. But their civilization could easily be destroyed by dragons. Okay, so human beings all soil their clothing with waste products? Inferior species.
You don't like your human form, do you?
Yes! And no, it's complicated.
Sure.
She's not physically attracted to Kobayashi in any way, only emotionally attracted to her after seeing what a kind and understanding person she is. So then, if Toru isn't thirsty, why does she always act so thirsty? Well, that's one of the things that makes this show great. Her sexual desires are there as a reflection of her character, specifically her emotional insecurities. As I said earlier, both Kobayashi and Toru are damaged and driven off crippling fears. Kobayashi's fear is intimacy. In her own words, she's not used to being wanted or even thought of that much, and she doesn't know how to handle this new relationship. She lives a very calculated life, not allowing herself to lose control even for a moment. She knows that she should give Toru more affection, but even then finds such things nearly crippling to do.
You know, Lukawa, to be honest, I'm grateful to Toru as well. Truth is, I didn't used to smile very much myself. I'd never admit that to her, though.
And that's the whole point of the show. It's about Kobayashi learning to tear down those barriers and allow herself to be vulnerable for the sake of others. Because, I mean, Toru is all in. She is all into this relationship. She was all in on day one. So the only hang-up here is Kobayashi. And I think it's something that a lot of us can relate to. It's hard to put yourself out there, especially if you don't think highly of yourself or if you've been burned before. It's much easier to hide inside your shell and never put your feelings on the line. But that doesn't work because, as we see here, it ends up hurting those close to you. Meanwhile, Toru is on the opposite end of the spectrum. The poor girl is starved for affection. She seeks intimacy and is deathly afraid of being rejected. Throughout the show, she is constantly asking for praise and seeking confirmation that those who love her actually love her. And if you think of Toru in this regard, then her lust takes on a whole new meaning. She chases after Kobayashi not due to physical desires, but because, just like with cooking or cleaning, sex is another way to confirm that Kobayashi wants her. If she accepts Toru's advances physically, then it would mean that she wants Toru emotionally. And that is why these scenes make so much sense. Toru does make an effort to push her way into a more intimate scenario with Kobayashi. And when Kobayashi agrees, that's confirmation for Toru. So she doesn't make any advances past that because she already got what she wanted, which was to be closer to her bae. I mean, you can see this all over the show. Look at this clip in episode 1 where Kobayashi buys Toru some clothes to thank her for helping out. Toru thinks this is the biggest gesture in the world because Kobayashi actually did something for her. Meanwhile, Kobayashi looks visibly in pain with her, how do they put it, dead fish eyes. In their relationship, we have the embodiment of both sides of this spectrum of sexuality in television. We have someone who intentionally censors her feelings and holds back, and someone who goes way over the top in an effort to get attention. Not only is this relationship full of comedic possibilities, but it's just a very interesting dynamic, and handled in such a way to make it feel special and heartwarming. There's some real chemistry here, and you can feel it in every single episode. So it's funny that a show with such an over-the-top sense of humor and ridiculous premise is able to have very down-to-earth and relatable messages about intimacy and sexuality. Because if you take a look at both the characters, neither one of them is really sexually attracted to the other. They're emotionally attracted to them, which bleeds over for one and not so much for the other. And honestly, I think that's one of the great advantages of animated media, the ability to have very abstract or fantastical ideas while still grounding them in realistic themes. And this is something that shows of this nature have really excelled in lately. Miss Kobayashi may just be one example, but there are many more out there like it. Steven Universe, Adventure Time, BoJack Horseman. You're able to tackle controversial topics such as love and sex, but do so with such a disconnect that keeps people from feeling threatened or uncomfortable. It's the best of both worlds, really. You can be controversial without being controversial, and give people a story that can hopefully help them grow as a result. And that's why I love Miss Kobayashi's Dragon Maid. Not just because the show has boobs, but because what it says with those boobs, and what statements the show makes about two people. And if there is anything I want you to take away from this video, it's this. Elma is best dragon.
You sliding glasses!